Okay, I'm going to start this webinar. Good morning to everyone. It's great to see you here at TESO's, the second day of TESO's conference, where we're focused more on practical interventions and advice and support for those of you working in the sector to better use some of the methods that are attempting to prove the causal type of evidence that Eliza has just outlined in her first speech. In this webinar, we're going to be focusing on quasi-experiments. We're very, very lucky to have an expert on this topic, Dr. Sonia Ilie, and I'm going to hand over to her. Just as a reminder, though, as some housekeeping, you are all here as participants, which means that you are muted and you will not be able to speak. However, you can use the Q&A function, and we welcome you using the Q&A function. Do not use the chat except to explain if there's any problems with seeing slides or other technical issues, or if you just want to give us a big thumbs up or complain about something, that's fine too. But otherwise, at the end of Sonia's presentation, I will be fielding those Q&As. So use the Q&A function, and it probably saves some of those questions for towards the end of Sonia's presentation. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sonia, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me as well, and kind of having an opportunity to talk about quasi-experimental designs as well. So I'm just going to share my slides, and hopefully you'll be able to see that right about now. So the topic of today is quasi-experimental evaluation designs, and the reason why we are talking about quasi-experimental work follows, I think, quite nicely on from Eliza's presentation just a couple of minutes ago, thinking about ways to establish causality, but recognizing that while causality and causal evidence is something that is desirable, it's sometimes very difficult to establish, given that we're dealing with the real life contexts of schools, colleges, universities, other further and higher education institutions, and sometimes a very busy intervention space. So within that, we're trying to think about practical ways of generating robust causal evidence. Now, I'll start with just a brief introduction on why we need evaluation in the first place. And as you've heard yesterday and earlier today, the What Works agenda really pushes us to think a bit more carefully about the types of evidence that we have, whether that's using the OFS standards of evidence, as you've just heard a couple of minutes ago, to understand what we know about what's effective in the sector, to inform professional practice, but also to one thing that I think is really important, to think about professional autonomy, and that is the variety of people who work in outreach, who are at the coalface essentially, needing to make evidence-based decisions about what to choose and how to essentially distribute what are fairly limited resources in this space. So if we want to get all of that kind of evidence, evaluation can help. But some types of evaluation are more useful than others when we come to think about those practical considerations. And I'd like to suggest today in this session that the quasi-experimental methods are one way in which we can do evaluation that is both robust and practically relevant. So when we're thinking about the kinds of evaluation that we want, I'd like to think about it being flexible, being practical, being collaborative, but generating good quality and causal evidence if at all possible. And by flexibility, I mean this potential of the evaluation design to adapt to the different contexts in which we're working. And one of the Q&A, or I suppose chat points that was being made in the previous session was about the fact that it's fairly difficult to attribute causality when we've got competing explanations, when there's a variety of things happening, when there might be a number of confounding variables or factors at play in a particular space. And while trying to identify those and pinpoint what that causal trajectory might sometimes be difficult, it is still possible while keeping this practicality aspect still at the forefront of what we want to do. So that's why we're thinking about causality as desirable, but sometimes challenging to establish through what can be seen as a gold standard approach, and that is randomization. And if you're really interested in randomization, there is a parallel session running on RCTs, which use randomization to establish the counterfactual, that what would have happened otherwise. And I'm glad to hear that these sessions are recorded, and those will be made available to everyone so that you can actually see those sessions as well, the ones that are running in parallel. So returning to this point about causality being desirable, as we've seen, but not, of course, to the detriment of other sources of evidence. There's a balance here around the need for impact evidence, or evidence of impact, and causal evidence of impact, and evidence of process, of the mechanisms through which things and different interventions in the outreach space, in the participation space, and the outcome space might be relevant. But focusing on the point about impact and causality, this is something we want, but sometimes it's really difficult to establish through these gold standard approaches. And quasi-experimental approaches come in to provide a slightly different take on this, and a slightly different way to randomized controlled trials of establishing this. And as I was saying, the challenge that these types of approaches face are these overlapping programs and interventions that young people and prospective students might be attending or participating in. This notion of competing explanations, what's actually driving the potential effect that we're seeing. And then, of course, ethical considerations and issues of risk associated with participation in different programs, but also in the evaluation of different programs themselves, all underscored by feasibility and practical considerations, as I've already mentioned. Now, from a methodological perspective, the impact evaluation challenge is that of estimating the counterfactual. In other words, the what would have happened otherwise. And the best counterfactual would be to travel back in time and not do something, or do something and then compare those outcomes. But since we don't have that, since we can't travel back in time, different evaluation and different research designs try to establish this counterfactual in different ways, because it's actually missing. We don't really know what it is. So RCTs, randomized controlled trials, do it by randomization, by randomly allocating participants, that depending on what your unit of analysis, those could be individuals, they could be schools, they could be colleges, or they could be areas, regions. There's a variety of designs within that. But although RCTs are great, and I will say that since it's the kind of work that I do, they're not always usable. And that's not because there's something wrong or there's something undesirable about them, but maybe there are practical considerations, or maybe the rollout of a particular intervention simply doesn't lend itself to a trial. And especially in relation to WP, so widening participation, outreach, access programs that take particular shapes, these might be slightly difficult to implement. So then quasi-experimental designs come in as an alternative type of evaluation and research approach that don't require randomization for the purposes of establishing that missing counterfactual. And they still establish a counterfactual, but they do that in different ways. And the argument goes that they are often more readily applicable to real life practice. In other words, we can use them with the natural way in which things happen, with closer to practice, essentially, designs. And if they are well implemented and well interpreted, it can generate robust causal evidence, and therefore there's a real value in these. So there's a lot of practical potential for quasi-experimental designs, and what I'll do in the next couple of minutes is offer an overview of that, and then an overview of a couple of examples of quasi-experimental designs, what they could be methodologically, with some practical examples of what they might look like in practice. So I've already mentioned this point about the lack of randomization being a potential draw, a good point for quasi-experimental designs. And that's because we understand that that random allocation might not always be possible. So instead, we can create comparison groups in slightly different ways. And we can do that either by having longer term information about what happens, and we'll have an example of that with one particular quasi-experimental design, or we can create comparison groups by using statistical approaches to match a variety of characteristics of participants that allow us to compare like with like. We can also work with natural designs, and I'd like to end on a point about that later on. And interestingly, I think from a very practical perspective, what we've seen in our own work in the Faculty of Education is that we can use these for self-evaluation, and you can use quasi-experimental designs collaboratively, and we can adapt these to new modes of working. And by that, I mean even responding to the challenges currently posed to both programs and program evaluation by the shift to online, as we're doing today, but also the shift to remote delivery of outreach, of WP interventions, of student participation interventions. So what I'll do in the next few minutes is offer an overview, at least at the start methodological, and then also with examples of a couple of quasi-experimental research designs. And here are a few that are interesting and that have been used in the WP and broader access to higher education space. And the first one I just called first difference, or before and after comparisons. Some people would argue, depending which line of thought you follow, that they're not really quasi-experimental designs as such, but I've included them because there's a real practical value in them. A second type of design is called a difference-in-difference, or a second difference quasi-experimental design. And I'll again give you both the logic of that and a couple of examples to see how they might work in practice. I was speaking earlier about creating these comparison groups that are similar, or as similar as possible, and we do those through matching or propensity score matching approaches, and there's a variety of statistical ways of doing that. And lastly, there's regression discontinuity designs and interrupted time series designs, and all of these different approaches that take into account or make use of variation, of step changes, for instance, in the delivery of something, and look at what happens at that point of discontinuity, for instance, what happens just below or just above a threshold for instance, participation or financial support for seat, or tuition fee loan eligibility in contexts other than the UK where that's the case. So I'll start with before and after comparisons and say that, of course, in terms of the counterfactual that they might be establishing, that's to some extent the weakest if you think that they're quasi-experimental designs in the first place, because it is the counterfactual is essentially things would have stayed the same. Now, that might be a reasonable assumption that you can make given the program or intervention that you're evaluating, but that might not be. That's a decision for the researchers, practitioners, or collaboration between these to be made in relation to the specific program that is being evaluated. Attribution of effects can be difficult, especially if competing explanations exist. And this takes me back again to the point that Eliza was making earlier around how do you disentangle what's causing what? Do we have situations of sort of reverse causation? Now, of course, because you have a before and after, so by definition, a longitudinal perspective, you can have some certainty about the ordering of effects, especially if you measure things at the right time. But there still remains a point to say, well, we've observed this change, but seeing whether that or deciding whether that change is attributable only to the intervention that we're looking at or we're interested in might be difficult, especially if there's other stuff happening. And this is an important point. But these limitations notwithstanding, it's actually, I think, a really useful way of starting to understand the impact and the potential impact of a program or an intervention. These types of before and after comparisons are fairly easy to implement, in the sense that you're only working with the group of participants who are involved in your intervention. And understanding that direction of change is important. And that's because both in experimental and in quasi-experimental work, we try to be as objective as possible, within reason, of course, but and as transparent as possible about the fact that we don't know what the effects of some of these interventions actually are. If we knew that they were all perfectly effective, we wouldn't be running the quasi-experiment or the experiment in the first place. So understanding that direction of change, how things are simply progressing over time in relation or associated with participation in a particular intervention, is useful in and of itself. And from a practitioner perspective, these types of comparisons can actually generate really interesting insights. Because if, for instance, a before and after comparison shows a decrease in a particular outcome of interest that ideally you would see an increase in, again, you can't attribute effects straightforwardly, but you can start to explore reasons and hypothesize as to why that might be the case, and then put in place other types of research approaches to really understand why that might be happening. And as a simple example, and I should say more generally, when I give these examples, they're all real life examples, and I need to thank a variety of people who I'm working with on a number of these things, including researchers in our team, and also practitioners in outreach and WP programs in a variety of institutions. So one work in progress example of a simple before and after comparison run by a Cambridgeshire-based outreach and fair access team looks at an online information advice and guidance program that's part of a wider school-based outreach intervention as part of the Uni Connect program. And they're using an existing online mentoring platform with an aim to improve student self-efficacy and higher education options knowledge. So how well students in schools and further education colleges are aware of this. And just briefly, they're applying a before and after design simply because they want to understand that change in student self-efficacy and knowledge of higher education options. And the team running this program are very much aware that that attribution of effects can be difficult, but it's still something that is really interesting to find out about and understand, even if the causality is only tentative. So we're not claiming causality in these types of designs. But other quasi-experimental designs can show causality quite strongly. And one of these is a difference in difference design. Or you can think of it as a second difference design, and I'll explain what that means in a second. Now, lots of evaluation of widening participation, higher education access, and higher education participation interventions exist using difference in difference designs. A lot of them are focused in the US context, and although it might feel like in this space they're relatively new, actually this type of approach has existed for a good 130 years at this point, and therefore it's something that is known and understood fairly well. And the logic of this particular type of quasi-experimental design is to combine before and after comparisons with information about the trends that were evident prior to an intervention, prior to a program being implemented. And there's an assumption that were nothing to have happened, that assumed difference or that observed difference between a potential comparison group and the intervention group would stay the same. So on your screen, you see this assumed constant difference in outcomes that is stays the same over time. And what's happening here is you're saying, let's select a comparison group, and again, not through randomization. And I think that's a really interesting the point here, and the value of these types of approaches, and then compare those outcomes with those of an intervention group, those participating or being offered an intervention. And assuming that constant difference in what would have happened, what can we see as this post-intervention trend for the intervention group, and what that intervention effect is highlighted on the slide. And there's a variety of statistical ways of controlling for all manner of things as part of diff-in-diff, or difference approaches. And the longer that time trend prior to the intervention is, the better information we have on how that difference in outcomes between the comparison and the intervention group is. And over time, we can see how that moves, and then the extra difference that participation in the program might have made. And it's from that we can draw out that inference around the impact of the specific program. So again, just to give you a couple of examples about this, we've been working with a range of practitioners in a large further education college in Peterborough, and they've commissioned an intervention to work in their college to increase the rate at which students act upon the aspirations that they hold. So this is not an aspiration raising program, it's rather to say to explore the kinds of things that students in this college want to achieve, and then enable them and equip them with the skills and knowledge to be able to do something about what they want to do. So in the difference quasi-experimental design evaluation that they've implemented alongside this intervention, they're using this design with students enrolled on level 3 qualifications at the college, and their comparison group is the same year group of students, but not participating in the program. So see, no randomization. And there's a before and after survey, and trying to understand where both the intervention and the comparison group were before the intervention and after the intervention, and looking at that difference in the difference over time. And I should say, some of this work has been affected by the current pandemic, and some of it is on hold, some of it is going ahead, but all of it was designed with a view of implementing these quasi-experimental approaches in a way that is practical, feasible, and builds this capacity with our colleagues. Another example that tries to add another dimension to a standard diff-in-diff or difference quasi-experimental design is in one high school in Suffolk, where a staff-led mentoring intervention is being evaluated. The aim of the intervention is to improve students' knowledge of post-16 options, and students are fairly young, they're in year 9, and it's in the comparison group is made up of students in the same year group, but not initially taking part. Again, there's a before and after survey to both the comparison and the intervention group. And after that after point, at the second survey point, students who didn't originally participate then have the opportunity to take part. So we're calling this a sort of a wait list design, which is quite common in randomized control designs, but of course ensures that if we see the right types of positive outcomes from this small scale but robust evaluation, we can then say it makes sense for students to continue to participate in this. And it also ensures that everyone has the same chances of doing this. And then a final example that I wanted to give you, because I'm mindful of time as well, is propensity score matching approaches. And I mentioned earlier that one way of, or one important point about quasi-experimental designs is that they allow us to compare like without requiring randomization. And randomization, that random allocation of participants to control or intervention groups, ensures that if the sample is large enough, any set of characteristics are then uniformly distributed. In other words, we can check if we've achieved balance. In the absence of randomization, we fully accept the fact that participants in an intervention group might be slightly different to those who are not taking part for a variety of reasons. But we can try through statistical means to match those participants on a variety of characteristics, including some characteristics that are related to the likelihood of them taking up the intervention in the first place. So what propensity score matching approaches require is the empirical identification of these factors, of these variables, as Eliza was talking about them earlier this morning, associated with intervention allocation. And that means that we require a lot of data. And that brings me to a broader point about implementing quasi-experimental designs, because they are a really interesting positive feature of these quasi-experimental designs is that they can use existing data in a system. And we are very lucky in this country to have access to very rich data, not just on school outcomes, but also on participation in a variety of interventions. And other sources of longitudinal data that we can use to create interesting comparison groups. The Higher Education Access Tracker and other similar services that Eliza was mentioning earlier are one of those sources of data. We've got data on applications, we've got data on actual access, we've got data on outcomes, and these things are really, really important. And this rich data landscape really allows for the application of quasi-experimental designs that rely on statistical matching tools to be successful. So I think it's a really good thing. So I wanted again to give you a couple of examples about of propensity score matching approaches. One from a higher education WP context and one that is not, but I think makes some interesting points that are sort of transferable to our area of interest. So one work in progress example, again, small scale and collaborative, but robust work. So we work with an academy in Peterborough, looking at an intervention again, that is staff-led, and it comprises of weekly targeted sessions, and some of them are football themed for any football fans out there, and that's because of a stated student interest in data previously collected through a large-scale survey to illustrate some post-16 options. So very specific, very targeted intervention, relatively small scale, working with year 10 white working class boys in this school. And using a comparison group of young people in the same school and in other schools in the local area, matched on a variety of background characteristics through a propensity score matching approach, ideally. And with, again, combining that with a before and after survey for both groups. So you can start to see how you can get information about these things, and in these quasi-experimental designs, combine them to some extent as such. So you could technically combine, and this has been done in this space before, difference in different approaches with matched comparison groups, and get even more robust evidence of causal impact. And the final point, or final example of a propensity score or a matching QED, so quasi-experimental design, is a work in progress that's actually funded by the Education Endowment Foundation, from whom you heard yesterday, and led by colleagues at RAND Europe. I was working with them for a while and continue my collaboration with them. And this is a non-WP intervention, as I mentioned earlier, but I think really interesting from a methodological perspective. And it's a program that is a national but targeted STEM, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics program. And that's a whole school professional development intervention aiming to improve student attainment in STEM and to improve teacher retention in STEM. And it's targeted to schools in particularly difficult circumstances, either as suggested by their offset rating or geographically, and that aligns with the opportunity areas, which are these place-based initiatives to improve social mobility. And the evaluation uses a quasi-experimental design. It's not a trial, as in it's not a randomized controlled trial. And it uses existing data at school level for both student attainment and teacher recruitment, or rather retention, to really understand the impact of the intervention. And it uses a machine learning algorithm to weight cases so as to create a matched comparison group at the school level for the schools, the many hundreds of schools taking part in this program. So I think it's really interesting because it can show the different ways, the different units of analysis that we can have in quasi-experimental designs, but also the fact that different types of statistical approaches can be used and can be combined. And it's not for us today to go into detail about how to do, for instance, a propensity score matching approach or something like that, but it's to understand sort of the logic of these approaches and their benefits and drawbacks. So I said at the beginning that I wanted to end on a point about natural experiments. And I think this is a really interesting point that to me bridges between experimental and quasi-experimental evaluation and research designs and can generate robust causal evidence, again, without that need for randomization. And again, it's not because randomization is in itself problematic, but it's because potentially it might not be practically feasible. And the way I like to think about this is that we can turn what can be deemed to be limited capacity or manifesting through phase rollouts or pilots or things like that into a positive evaluation attribute, especially if that phase rollout or the pilot of a then larger program initially happens in a way where for the individual, allocation to that intervention, for instance, is random. So in other words, what I'm talking about are situations where you've got programs that, for instance, start in some counties but not others in a region, or start in some schools but not others. And that decision of which schools or which areas or which universities or you name it take part is driven by a variety of factors that have nothing to do with the individuals who are to be found in those, I suppose, clusters is what we would call them. And for that reason, that participation at the individual level can be considered random. And the fact that potentially there weren't enough resources to roll out a program entirely to the whole population of interest initially can be turned for the purposes of evaluation into a positive. We can make use of that exogenous variation at the individual level and use that different time start of an intervention to generate causal evidence by looking at trends before, by looking at trends after, by comparing over time, by using diff-in-diff, difference in difference approaches, for instance. So I'll wrap up by saying that quasi-experimental designs could be less onerous than randomized control trials, especially from that perspective of randomization. They can be practical, flexible, adaptable, and I hope the examples that I've given you, all small scale and all driven by practitioners in this space, to whom I'm incredibly thankful that they've taken this challenge on board, that they can be implemented. And if implemented properly, they can generate robust causal evidence. We need to be careful about how we communicate the results and how we translate our findings into practical evidence. But as researchers, I personally have a very strong a feeling that we have to have this as a duty of translating this evidence properly into something that is usable by the sector and ultimately addressing these enduring quality gaps that TASO and others in the system want to address. So I'll stop there, but only thing I'll say is that I've collected a whole list of references of experimental and quasi-experimental studies in WP that people might be interested to read. Some of them are UK-based, some are not, but all are really interesting and show different approaches and different applications of these methods. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Great. I mean, I'm definitely interested in that list, so I'll be taking a look at that after this. We are recording this session, so and we'll be sharing slides afterwards for the participants. So we do have some questions in the Q&A. I'm going to take two together because I think they're connected, and it's around ethics. And I think there's sort of three, I suppose, elements of these two questions. The first is the ethical dilemmas of running a randomized control trial, especially in outreach programs. I think the thought here is we think that this outreach might work. Is it ethical to withhold it? And that seems to be the implication of what randomization would require. So that's sort of question one. Do you agree with that, I suppose? So Johnny Rich's question actually is one of the limitations of RCTs and outreach activities is the ethical question of establishing a comparable control group that does not receive potentially beneficial interventions. And then his follow-on is, would you say that quasi-experiments suffer from the same ethical quandaries, or would you say they're more of an opportunity ethically, and if so, why? And then a further kind of elaboration, I suppose, of that question is Ruth Hand's question, which is, are there any specific ethical issues for difference in difference, which is one of the quasi-experimental examples you've used? Is there any ethical issues with collecting before and after views from a comparison group? If it's entirely voluntary, is there an issue about getting a good enough sample size? So getting a bit more specific, I suppose. So I don't know how you want to answer those, but I think those are great and important questions.
Absolutely, definitely. I'll take them one after the other.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where we go. I'm mindful of time. We probably have about 5-10 minutes, but you'll let me know.
You have 10 minutes. We have 10 minutes for Q&A.
Oh, perfect. So on the ethics of RCTs, particularly in this space, this is an issue that comes up quite a lot. And it doesn't just apply to higher education specific interventions. We can make the same point about school-based interventions as well, whether those are for attainment raising purposes or any other outcome that we might be interested in. And I think my perspective is always to say, if we had the robust evidence that a particular program or intervention was already effective, we wouldn't be doing the particular test, trial, quasi-experimental design that we are in the first place. So I understand that there might be different sources of evidence, for instance, qualitative evidence that can suggest that a program is well liked, participants self-report perceived impact or perceived gains in whatever domain, and that can make us think definitely this is causing impact. But the reality of it is we don't know unless we do the work, unless we actually trial it in an RCT or with a quasi-experimental design. So then the notion, it's almost a flipped question. The risks are similar, I feel, in relation to offering an intervention about which we don't have robust evidence of impact or positive impact, as is around withholding it. So we have to be careful about not kind of jumping to one conclusion on one side, but not on the other side. And of course, if we do see evidence of negative impact, then we have a duty to immediately stop what we're doing. And this is very similar to what a medical trial would do. And of course, there is a reason why some of the language that we use comes from that particular tradition of research, though, of course, we have to apply things to our own social science context. But similarly, if we see that a particular intervention has had a positive impact, we can then offer it. And one example of this is a randomized control trial that I've been involved with for a number of years, more than I care to admit, where we use a wait list design from the very beginning, particularly or precisely because there was evidence from other contexts that the intervention might be effective. So in some sense, we said, okay, there's enough here to say in other places this might work, or this seems to work. We don't feel that it's appropriate to withhold it entirely. But what we can do is say, well, let's put in place a research design that makes use of the fact that we can kind of come in and collect data at this point, and after that, we can offer the intervention again. And in the WP space, we recently completed and reported on a trial of a mentoring and rather a tutoring intervention through a randomized control trial. And again, that had a wait list.
Can I just come in, because actually we've
Yeah.
probably copied you in the design of this. Our summer schools project is the exact same. There's greater demand for places on the summer school than there is supply. Lots more kids want to go to summer schools than universities are able to offer. And if we, instead of selecting kids on the basis of some other decision, we're selecting them on the basis of randomization. So we do think that summer schools have a positive impact on interest in applying to university. But we feel that by randomizing, that's no less ethical, because we're offering everyone, the same number of kids are getting the opportunity that otherwise would get it. And we're trying to control for factors that when you select on the basis of, this kid is more interested in already, or other forms of selection, you're getting the same beneficiary group, but you're able to try to better isolate what is this really having the effect that we think, and which aspect of this program, because we have different providers, is doing the work. So I do agree with you that sometimes the ethical question is posed one way, but you could pose it the other way. Surely if we could better try to isolate what's doing the work here, we're obligated to do so, right? Instead of just continuing to offer a program that we're not certain why it works.
Absolutely. I think that point about, limited capacity, I always say, random allocation is sometimes the fairest way of distributing places, right? So if you say to someone, this is massively oversubscribed, okay, you can stratify, right? You can account for certain characteristics of making sure that there's equal numbers of gender or region, schools from which students come, and that's absolutely fine. But it's a fair way of distributing what is a limited resource, and I think we can make use of.
So I think we've rebutted the RC. Well, not rebutted. We've kind of provided us an explanation as to why RCTs in HE and participation can meet ethical requirements. But what about the question then further of quasi-experiments? Do you think they're even, and difference in difference specifically is also been asked about here?
I think similar issues apply, though I like the question around kind of what's in it for the comparison group from which we collect data on two separate points, right? I think that's the core of the question. Is that burden warranted? And it depends how you do it, and it depends what you do with that information. In the examples that I was showing, because these are very much embedded or groups of participants embedded in the schools, there is still, that information is put to good use, not for the purpose of providing an intervention that might contaminate the one being evaluated, but for other reasons and for other purposes. So there's still, on balance, a positive outcome for these people, and we do something good with the information that we collect. And then there's a point, of course, to be made that collecting information or having these surveys done actually contributes to the generation of good evidence that can then help many more others. And therefore, there's a public good argument in that as well. Of course, ethically, we have to be mindful, and we have to keep these as short as possible and as targeted as possible, and only ever collect the data that we're actually going to use. So all of these questionnaires or surveys that I mentioned take on average 7 minutes for students to complete within a normal school context. And by normal, I mean what's currently going on as well.
Sorry, I have a presentation to follow on how Tezo is using this, and I'm going to address the questions that Liz Austin, Andrew Chapman, and Nasser Latif ask, I think. So I'm going to throw to you the others, which is sorry, where did it go? Sorry, we've got 7 or 8 questions in the Q&A. The third one from Jill Costin. Apologies if I've mispronounced your name. Hi, this is fantastically interesting and useful. Thank you. How do you measure likelihood of participating in the intervention, i.e. to identify the non-intervention comparison group? Thank you. Yeah, I think this is particularly important. Like, how do we determine if we've got the numbers for a diff-in-diff, I suppose, as well?
Yeah, well, so I suppose, as with any of these designs, you can do your power calculations, try to understand what number of participants you would need at any of the different units of analysis that you might have in your study based on what you are potentially hypothesizing the effect to be. So if you think you're going to have an intervention with a massive, big effect, then the sample that you'll need will be smaller. If not, you need a very, very large sample for an effect that's potentially small. And there's a couple of other considerations within that, of course, around statistical power and all manner of things, but still. But then in terms of understanding who's participated and who's not, it goes back to what I was saying around the need for data. So one example would be to think about if you've got information on, let's say, an intervention that has been offered to one year group in a school, but not to the same year group in another school, you would want information on both those things and for both those groups of people. Then the first step in a propensity score matching approach, for instance, would be to run a regression model that says, here's all these factors that might be associated with participation. And participation would be coded as 1 if you've taken part, 0 if you haven't taken part. It's a logistic regression model. You'd understand which of those factors are correlated with that likelihood of participation, and then you would try to match on those. I know that's fairly a technical response, but
no, that's good. That's good. And I think, sorry, there's one further question that I won't address, and actually that may be further questioned once they see my presentation, which is from Andrew Chapman. Using difference and difference, how do we check that the difference due to the intervention is not due to some unmeasured difference between the two groups? So I think you sort of hinted at this in terms of how we present these findings and how we talk about causality, but we may do our best to measure as many characteristics of the two groups as we can, but can we ever really be sure? And I think I'm about, you have 2 minutes to answer this, but when I think when I present our presentation, if there's time at the end, it'd be good to get your reflections on the TESO application of difference and difference and whether or not that sort of concern is warranted in our case.
No, absolutely. I mean, to some extent, we can almost never get away from the fact that there might be something else going on. And we have to have that sort of level of understanding of that sort of remaining uncertainty. What diff-in-diff tries to do, especially with that, especially when you have a longer time trend prior to the intervention, is to really try to establish what that difference is, right? That's the point about that constant difference between the groups, and saying that as we look at that difference, anything within that is captured by it, and then whatever extra change or extra like that difference in the difference comes from these things that we have actually tinkered with or changed, in this case, the intervention itself. So that's how you would then say, well, there might be a variety of factors that affect that difference between the comparison and the intervention group, but because we're tracking it over time and we're looking at the difference in the difference, then we're addressing that. And if you add matching to that and make those groups as similar as possible, then you're even closer to a true estimate of the causal impact.
Great. Thank you, Sonia. So I'm now going to present some slides that will try to answer a question that's been raised around the Black, Asian, minority ethnic degree awarding gap. And one as well on post-entry interventions, because that's what our intervention is. It's a post-entry, and it sort of has a qualitative element. So that answers Liz Austin, Ellen Austin's, and Nasser Latif's question. So I'm going to start sharing my slides if I can. And sorry, pushed the wrong button. Can you see this? Okay, so this is a quick run through of how TESO is using this approach. And in fact, I think you'll see that one of the slides is a kind of reproduction of one of Sonia's. So one of the questions, I think it was Nasser in the Q&A, asked the question about equality gaps. And we know, and this is the sort of data that sort of over time of the gap between Black and white students in terms of the proportion who get a good degree outcome. And by good degree outcome, that's a first or a 2-1. And we can see that this gap is persistent over time and quite extensive. And the question is, what can we do to tackle it? And I think it is challenging to think of what a randomized control trial in this space might look like. So we're using a quasi-experimental approach. What is the sort of background or the context in which we're doing it? So you're probably all familiar with the debate around curriculum reform or decolonizing the curriculum or pedagogy in the classroom. So what we're taking advantage of is that there are certain courses at some universities, or probably now most universities, that are reformed modules or courses. These are courses that have some element of either diversity mark, is how some people refer to it. Some people refer to it as decolonizing. The providers that we're working with use different language, but the ultimate intervention is the same. There's courses that have different, that are reformed, and there are courses that are unchanged. Now, the challenge is that the reformed courses or models may have different students on them. The demographic features of the students, the interests of those students may be different from those who are on the unchanged modules or courses. You might expect that, right? That there'll be different entry requirements as well. So some of these courses might have different kinds of students for that reason. There might be different demographic profiles. We might expect more ethnic minorities to be on courses that have potentially have been decolonized. So we can't just straightforwardly compare outcomes, saying, you know, the kids the students who went on this course have better outcomes afterwards in terms of tackling that BME attainment gap than the ones who have been on the unchanged module or course. So we're using the difference in difference approach for this. And as Sonia says, it's one of the advantages that we've got is we've got quite a good bit of data over time from these various modules. So we've got a fair amount of good data that tracks backwards. And we're doing this within institutions, right? So we're at least able to hold that relatively constant. Well, not relatively, it's within institution comparisons that we're making. So within one provider, it's the University of Leicester and the University of Kent, respectively. So this is exactly Sonia's slide. So what we see here is sort of adapted for our purposes is the red line is the change over time in the performance of students who are on unchained modules or courses. So these courses have not had any curricular reform. And then we have on the green line the assumption that those unreformed modules and courses were already, there was already a difference in the performance between these two groups. But we know the nature of that difference over time, and we can track that over many years. So we have that trend. And this is the difference then that we'd expect going forward if nothing changed, right? If the two courses were otherwise kept the same, that the reform modules were not reformed, and if the unchanged modules were not changed either. However, we have a moment, which is the thing that we're taking advantage of, that this reform has been introduced. There's been a change in the way in which some modules are being delivered. So if we see this kind of pattern, right, that those students, I'm sorry to use the word kids, those students who went on, who are enrolled in a reformed module or course, see a larger increase in, in the proportion who are getting first or 2-1s, we then can attribute it to the reform, because otherwise we would have expected the trend line to follow the dotted line that you see below. So this is the difference in the difference between the two courses, between the students who went on the reformed or decolonized or diversified curriculum and those who did not. So in brief summary, because I think I do have time to get 2 or 3 questions about this, or for Sonia to give her reflections. We'll be working with the University of Kent and Leicester to evaluate curricular reform. So we're still in the early days of this, right? So we're collecting the data now, but we have some indications that there may be a result, but we are still collecting those data. It is a quasi-experimental approach, as you've seen. We're using differences in differences. We are, and this was one of the questions, we're working on this in parallel with local in-depth qualitative evaluation. We're asking both lecturers, you know, what they think and how they understand what they're doing in terms of the two different interventions in Kent and Leicester. But we're also interviewing students to ask them, you know, what they think, and also to identify if they think there's any other reasons or any other explanations as to why, of how they experienced these courses. So to try to get at some of the student experience as well. And if you want to find out more, you should go to the research tab on our website, and you can look up the Race Equality Gaps project. We're obviously doing this because this is a long-standing inequality, as that first slide shows, and it's quite a practical question. Will this, in fact, tackle what is a long-standing and persistent gap, a gap that the Office for Students has required institutions, providers to tackle, and that it does seem to be quite stubborn otherwise. So while there's a lot of, I suppose, national policy and public debate about some of these issues, I think we're focused on a bit more of a pragmatic question: is does this actually have any effect on tackling the BAME degree awarding gap, something that we're all familiar with for many years now. So thank you. And I think there might be time now. Yes, we have about 3 or 4 minutes actually for further questions. And I don't know, Sonia, if you want to say anything further to, because I'm not actually an expert on this. I'm presenting those slides that my colleagues have put together and that Eliza has worked on. But I don't know if you have any other thoughts or comments on what we're doing there.
Just a very brief one, that I actually think the addition of qualitative data and qualitative evidence on process, on perceived outcomes, on perceptions of the intervention or whatever it is that is being evaluated is hugely beneficial and extremely important. Okay, you can't derive causal evidence from qualitative data alone, but without it, it's really hard to understand how a particular positive effect might have come about. So I'm very strongly of the opinion that in either experimental or quasi-experimental designs, the addition of qualitative work is incredibly important.
Yeah, I think that's a really important note, maybe even to end on. I mean, it's one of the things in my previous role that I got. I was previously the director of a race equality think tank. I got quite frustrated that people wanted to frame the question as, is it class or is it race? And it seemed to be that everybody wanted to be either or. And I didn't understand why it couldn't be both and. You know, both we need to understand class inequality and we need to understand racial inequalities. And it's possible that both can be drivers of unequal outcomes. And similarly here, I've never quite understood why you have to only do, you have to sort of tribally support only quantitative or qualitative research proposals. I think Tezo's view is very much that we need both, and that the research question that you're asking should be what guides you rather than any sort of prior commitment to one methodology over another. I don't know if there's anything, if you've seen the other questions, if there's any other ones you want to answer. We have about two more minutes.
There's a final question on COVID disruptions, and I think that's a really good point. And the sad answer to some extent is sort of two-part. One, yes, there's been an immediate kind of short-term impact on some of the deployment of this research, and of course the activity itself. Very much aware of that. But second, that time series won't be comparable. And I think that is a much longer term, real, genuine issue here. That means that sort of 2020, 2021 data might not be as usable or as useful as it could otherwise be. It's interesting because, of course, there's an external shock, and thinking internationally, the pandemic hit at different times and things happened in different ways. So there's learning to be had from that, if there is any silver lining to this horrific situation. But if we're thinking locally, and if we're thinking about the types of data that we have access to, clearly there's been a longer term impact on the fact that you can't compare data collected now to data collected in 2018, 2019, even on outcomes, right? Key stage 4 outcomes, key stage 5 outcomes that we rely on so much in education trials, either as outcomes or as a baseline. Those are problematic as well, not in and of themselves, but as a time trend.
So but I suppose if you're looking at a particular cohort, all 18-year-olds or all 14-year-olds are similarly affected. So I suppose
absolutely. So in that sense, absolutely, in that sense. But if you were thinking of a time trend, kind of a diff-in-diff thing going sort of 2017, 18, 19, 20, 21, what you would see is a very different kind of break in the data. But yes, if you're looking at a cohort that goes through this at the same time and experiences the same exogenous shock, in this case, are the pandemic, and that's fine to consider because it's on average. the same overall experience. Not that means it's the same individual experience.
Yes. No, I agree. It's something that, yeah, I've been thinking about looking at the Millennium Cohort study because it might have some interesting findings on that. I think we're going to have to wrap up. I don't know if you can answer this, but I suppose one question, a final question, even for me, is how do we support people who are actually interested in using some of these approaches, but might feel that they don't have the tools or the experience to do so? Because I think there's a lot of appetite, right? I think people are aware that some of the evaluation methods they don't get at causal data. They think that certain interventions are working and they'd be very willing to try, but they want to make sure they're doing it rightly. And I think Tezo is here to try to support, but we are still a small team. Do you have any other thoughts on resources or tips or tools to help people deliver on these kinds of methods?
So I think, first of all, there's been a huge increase in the capacity around evaluation associated with some national programs, outreach programs in particular, that have emphasized evaluation and therefore capacity building on evaluation alongside that. One thing we've been doing with my team in Cambridge being sort of external evaluators of one of these UniConnect partnerships, for instance, for the past 4.5 years now, is in 2019, we launched a program, sort of a local program to support capacity building in particularly quasi-experimental and diff-in-diff evaluation approaches. And the examples that I've given you are examples of work that practitioners have implemented with our support in their schools and colleges. And that doesn't mean that they're all these projects will emerge with, the perfect, robust, tidy evidence, but it doesn't matter at this point. That's not what we're aiming with these projects for. We're aiming to build that capacity, to have that collaborative conversation, and to really understand what's feasible and what isn't in a local contextualized way. So I think there are ways to build that capacity, and more workshops, interventions, but networks are being built by the people that do this.
That's great news, and I think that's a good way to end it. One of the reasons we're doing this approach, and that we've learned from Sonia and others, is we hope that whatever findings we have can be replicated in other institutions. So do look out for the findings of our study that probably won't be, will not be till 2022. But we hope that you've both learned something through this seminar about quasi-experimental approaches. I think it was very clear. I learned a lot personally about how the different kinds of quasi-experiments designs that you might consider, but also you might be willing now to consider trying one of them, obviously with support and from your institution, from your university. But as ever, the point of these methods is to understand better what actually tackles equality gaps in higher education. And that's the reason we're running these seminars today. And I want to thank you all for your participation. There's now a gap of only about 15 minutes until the next set of seminars that are running coterminously. So you will have had to have selected one of the three. So I'm going to just with that say thank you to Sonia. It was a great presentation. Thank you to the audience for your questions. And I'm now going to end this session. And you have to, those of you who are attending a separate Tezo seminar will have to click on that link separately to register for whatever panel you're registered for at noon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.